guys. Intro number 2.
Oh, God. Please no.
Welcome to Cultivate and Keep with co-host Jeremy and
Corey.
That's good, right?
It wasn't as bad.
Guys, I'm trying out new
loud.
intros, you know.
There's definitely going to be some distortion.
Yeah.
If I look at the little graph right now, it's just like this huge thing. Like,
there was a seismic earthquake.
Yeah, pretty
crazy.
much. That is Jeremy's voice.
Man. Anyway, well, guys, welcome on a serious note.
Thanks for still listening.
Thank you
even after yesterday.
For listening. We are going to get right into things, but real quick, we have just one business item, and that is the 2-week challenge. If you have not heard yet, we are doing a pretty cool giveaway. So you guys can enter and participate by going to cultivateandkeep.com/challenge. And right there, you can enter in. All you have to do is share this episode of the podcast or a blog post. And by doing that, your name gets entered into, not a raffle, but basically you increase your chances of winning. So the more you share through our website, then the higher chance you have to win. So I shouldn't even say chance. I mean, then you will win if you do it the most. Simple as that.
That's right. That's how we men like it.
Yeah, so we're going to be giving away a few books, a Kindle, some limited time Cultivate and Keep merch, a hat, maybe a beanie, and some shirts.
Yep.
And bragging rights, too.
That's right. Dude, bragging rights from too. We'll give you a shout out on the podcast.
Shout out,
for sure. Big shout out. A few shout outs.
Anyway, I think that's it, Corey.
That's it.
Anything else?
No. I mean, as a part of it, we're doing a blog post and podcast episode a day for the first 14 days of December. So it's a win-win. So it's a challenge for us to do all this content. And it's a challenge for you to help us spread the word and share the content.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All right,
cultivateandkeep.com/challenge. So today, I feel like I always end up talking about I think he's probably most likely my favorite biblical character, person. Is a character only fictional?
Oh, good point. I wouldn't say character. I would say just person
figure.
in the Bible.
Figure,
yeah.
He's just a guy. I mean, yeah. We're talking about Joshua of the Bible. So we're going to format it in 9 lessons every man can learn from Joshua of the Bible. So let us know what you think of this kind of format. It's a little more structured than usual, but we're just going to kind of roll through some of the lessons. But I love Joshua, and I keep going back on him. In fact, I think the first time that I really sat down and studied Joshua was for some sort of Bible class in high school at Foothills, in Mr. Newkirk's class, and I had to do like this. It was pretty much like the longest, most extensive report. I think my report ended up being like 20 or 30 pages long or something. Jeez. But it made me like fall in love with the kind of story and like the whole persona of Joshua, because it's just so gnarly of a story to me. So to give it a little bit of context, you can find Joshua by going to the Bible and flipping over to the book of Joshua. It's pretty straightforward there. But
you lost me.
Yeah. Wait, what? Where do I go? But Joshua, interesting enough, began life, I don't know if you knew this, as a slave in Egypt. So, you know how the story goes with Moses, where God calls Moses in the burning bush, and he says, go free my people from the Egyptians. The Israelites had spent like a few hundred years, at least 100, I'm not really sure, I should go back and look, as slaves in Egypt. And I was there, and it was like a very racist thing to do, basically. It was just like the Jews, the Israelites, all of you are slaves forever. So Moses, this guy, comes waltzing in alone, and he challenges Pharaoh, who is basically like the king of the universe at that time, to let the Israelites go. And by all the miraculous plagues and different things that happen, the Lord had empowered them to do, Moses successfully leads the Israelites out of Egypt and frees them from slavery. And Joshua was one of those slaves that was freed. But like I was thinking that, I was like, that is so, I could not imagine that. Like,
so Joshua and Caleb. I'm not sure why I never put 2 and 2 together.
Yeah. So all of Joshua's life, think about the context of where he came from and his upbringing. He was born a slave, and he grew up a slave. I'm not sure how old he was when Moses came in and freed them, but he probably wasn't that old. I'm guessing he was maybe around our age, possibly. I don't know. There's probably some sort of biblical indicators there, but if you look, but he rose. So he was a slave, and then when they were freed, he rose kind of up the ranks to be a leader of Israel, and he was kind of one of the military leaders to Moses, and was, really faithful in obedience to God. But one of the kind of themes that we can pull out here is that your circumstances don't define your destiny, right? And like Joshua is the biggest testament in that, and that he was literally a slave. Like, I don't know if there's any other circumstance that could make you think that your destiny is to be anything great, but like a slave is like the worst it can get, basically.
Yeah. So my dad, so both my parents came from pretty broken families. My dad, he was 15 years old, and on Christmas Eve, his stepdad asked him to leave the house and said, I want to basically have only my family in my house. And my dad was just his stepson. So 15 years old, Christmas Eve, he's basically kicked out of his home, has nowhere to go. And my mom, kind of similar. There was no dad around, single mom, 5 daughters. And she was like, I think the oldest of 5. And she moved out when she was 16. So they both came from pretty much nothing. And they shared like a common like kind of goal for their life was they wanted to break that cycle. So in their family before them, every generation pretty much was kind of like that. Really broken. No one knew the Lord. Just chaos. And so they wanted to break that cycle and basically start a new line. And they did that, which is cool. So yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. What you were born into, what one day makes up your life doesn't have to always be your life. It can change. Also like thinking, so your day-to-day circumstances, does it have to ruin your day? And so if you're having like a rough morning, I think it's easy for a lot of people to like throw that day out and say, oh, maybe, better luck next time or better luck tomorrow.
Even if it's at like 7 a.m. in the morning.
Well, we can break that down. And so we can think, okay, obviously it doesn't control our destiny, but even like day to day, like if you have a rough morning, that does not have to ruin your day. You could overcome those rough morning circumstances.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's cool too, because in Joshua's story, like, I don't know if there's any other time where God displayed so much like divine, miraculous power. Like, the 10 plagues you had when they were coming out of Egypt, you had like this fiery tornado that was leading them at night. And then like every day God would supply manna from the heavens, and like just food would appear on the ground for them to eat. Like, I don't think you could be any more immersed in God's miraculous power. But you've got to think that when Joshua was just a young kid, or even when he was just a young boy, like he was probably thinking like, I'm going to be a slave forever. Yeah. I think that's so cool because, well, one, there's some truth to without God, you sort of are a slave to your circumstances in a certain way. Like you only have so much power over yourself and over other things. But with God, literally there's no circumstance that can contain you. There's no circumstance that can determine who you are, who you're supposed to be, or how God can use you. So God is kind of like the ultimate circumstance breaker or achiever, or however you want to call it.
Something else to think about. I don't think it's in this story, but Mark Hoffman often talks about this. He says that your perception of a circumstance often determines the outcome. So whether that's, okay, today's starting off really bad. If I decide today sucks, like just the worst, like whatever, then I'm probably going to have a pretty rough day, right? Yeah. Or even thinking like bigger picture, like if, you have a pretty, rough, home life, and you weren't born into much. If that's your outlook of my life sucks, this is the worst thing ever. Well, chances are it probably will turn out bad for you. But if you spin it and choose a positive outcome, a positive, just really outlook on what you're facing, it really can change the reality of what happens rather than a negative outlook.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to read it just one more time because it's so good. Your perception of your circumstances often determines the outcome. So, I mean, that's so true, because the way that we perceive things is the outcome often. Like, it could be a good day or a bad day depending on how you see it. Because, again, like you said, bad circumstances don't have to ruin your day. It could still be a good day with good outcomes, but if all you perceive it as is a bad day with bad outcomes, then that's what it's going to be. You can always find the good in something. So, second lesson, so when Moses sent the 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan. So just reverse really quick again. God calls Moses to bring the Israelite people out of Egypt. And originally God's vision for Moses was for Moses also to bring them into the promised land, into the land where they could fortify and secure it for themselves. Moses this is kind of the crux of it, right? But at this point, they've made it kind of to the barrier, like sort of to the entry of the promised land. And now they were going in to scout it. So when Moses sent the 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan, which is the promised land, only Joshua and Caleb, so 2 out of 12, believed that the Israelites could conquer the land with God's help. And this is ultimately what kind of doomed Moses and that generation of people from entering the promised land. They had to wait 40 years. But it's so interesting because Joshua wasn't afraid to be different. He wasn't afraid to challenge others. He wasn't afraid to be contrarian. He wasn't afraid to kind of just speak out. I don't know if you've heard of like that old experiment where, they kind of like, they'll put someone into a classroom and someone's like, there's a teacher and there's other people, other students around him, and everyone but them will know, like they'll give the wrong answer intentionally, and then they'll see what the real person will say, whether like they'll go with what they actually know. It'll be something really simple, like 11 plus 22 equals, and then people will say like 48, like 49, or like 32, and then the guy's like looking around like, are these people stupid? And the majority of the time, people will say the wrong answer just to fit in with the crowd. But it's so interesting that Joshua, just even in like the hugest of circumstances, wasn't afraid to be the one of 12, or I guess one of 2 that were going to speak out and be different.
Has me thinking, like, practically, how can this apply? Like really in like day-to-day life, because you think about either scenarios like that or bigger picture stuff. We think, how can we be different in this? But what about just day-to-day? Like, what kind of things could we benefit from if we weren't afraid to be different, weren't afraid to kind of walk away from what the crowd might be doing? Not in a bad way, but well, it's kind of a good thing to think about.
And I think that raises a good kind of point that there's going to be a lot of situations where we could just be like the crowd, or we could just kind of go with the flow, where maybe we're supposed to speak up, or maybe we're supposed to be a little contrarian, maybe we're supposed to be a little unconventional, even if it means that people don't view us the same way or like us, or that we're passed up for an opportunity. But maybe it's just because it's the right thing to do. But I love that. So basically, Joshua wasn't afraid to be different in defense of God, essentially. So lesson number 3, the next progression in Joshua's story was, since the 10 of the 12 didn't believe, God sent the Jews to wander the wilderness for 40 years until the unfaithful generation died. And of those spies, only Joshua and Caleb survived. So what I think is so interesting about this is that Joshua had to wait 40 years to fulfill his calling and quote unquote get his moment. And I was talking about this at my small group last night, and how God cast a vision for Moses, and then that vision was passed on to Joshua. But Joshua had to wait 40 years after he went into the land of Canaan and saw it. Think about waiting for something for 40 years. And I think it's just a testament of sometimes your vision takes a while to kind of come to fruition.
It's
sometimes
that process of waiting.
It's not going to be immediate. Sometimes you have to wait for your moment.
I think with that, we need to consider what happens during that process. Because just at face value, thinking waiting for, there's a promise, so or you don't know, but you have hopes of what's going to come, and then 40 years you're wandering in a wilderness. That freaking sucks. Like and most of them died and didn't even.
And it's not fair.
Not fair.
Yeah.
So for us, we don't have really anything probably to that degree, but we still have situations where there's promises, expectations, plans, hopes, dreams, whatever it is, and we're waiting. Probably most cases, probably a couple of years, but we're still waiting. But in that process of waiting, I think so much good comes from that. That's often overlooked, and we don't really consider or take from that what we should, of just that process of having to wait and trust, and trust in the Lord and hope, and just believe for what's right and for what's good to come.
Yeah, definitely. Lesson number 4. So now finally Joshua gets his moment, and actually, I mean, his vision, his moment isn't even fulfilled yet. Now he gets to start on his vision of actually leading the Israelites into the promised land and taking over. But So Joshua took over from Moses, and the thing that's so interesting to me is if you think about Moses, I think some kind of biblical study, or I forget what you call them, but people who study the Bible, what are they called? Oh my gosh,
I had it and it went away.
Okay. Anyways, a lot of very smart people who know the Bible will often kind of paint a picture of Moses as being a very reluctant leader. And I think he also had Aaron to kind of speak for him because he wasn't a great communicator in a lot of ways. But still, you have to think about Moses single-handedly, with God's help, led the people of Israel out of Egypt. Egypt was the most powerful nation and government and civilization of all time at that time. And the dude had some reputability. You know what I mean? Like, he had a really big kind of persona, and people trusted him and knew Moses. This was the guy who led us out of Egypt. And although they didn't have faith in him a lot of times, Joshua had really big shoes to fill, and that's scary. One of the keys to his success was Joshua 1:7, where God tells him in kind of his inaugural, his calling for Joshua, he says, "Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go." So I love that Joshua had these huge shoes to fill, but then the Lord goes all the way down to the most simplest principles of be strong and courageous and know the word, study my law.
So I just finished actually reading Joshua about a month ago. Funny, went back through it. And as I read through it, I underlined and kind of made a few notes around every time I saw that phrase, be strong and courageous, and had me thinking. So I think that's one of those terms and phrases that we hear as Christians, and it's comforting, and it's like, oh, I can be strong and I'm courageous. Kind
of rah-rah.
That's what we think. But as I was reading it through this time, kind of the reality struck me that it is encouraging, but it's all we have to think, what is it actually telling us? It's telling us that we have to be strong, we have to be courageous, and still go through whatever it is we're worried about. And I think most of the time we think of, okay, I'm just going to be strong, but it's going to be all good. But the reality is we still have to actually face what we're afraid of and what we're worried about. But the Lord's telling us to be strong and go through it. But I still think it's good to remember that. It's not just the Christianese comfort, but there's a reality that plays with it.
Right. And again, with the Lord, I think it's funny. I was talking with my small group about it last night again, but I was like, when God says something twice, it's important. God should never need to say something twice. But then I looked, and I think in the first 11 verses, he says it at least 3 times. I was like, wow, God must really want this to be ingrained in our minds. And I think, again, like you said, if God's telling you to be strong and courageous, that there's going to be some stuff that you're going to have to deal with. There's going to be some crap that you're going to have to go through, and some scary stuff that's going to be dealt your way. I think the lesson there is, when you have big shoes to fill, or when you have something scary about to go through, or there's something hard that you have to do, get back down to the basics and remember, be strong and courageous, and then know the law, study the law, be close to God, in other words. Okay, lesson number 5. So now, to enter the land, the Israelites had to cross the flooded Jordan River, and when the priests and the Levites carried the Ark of the Covenant into the water stopped flowing, and this miracle mirrored the one that God had performed at the Red Sea. So to give a little more context into this, the Jordan River is this massive, rushing river, and if you stepped in it or went into it, you were going to get swept away. There's no kind of physical way to cross without having some sort of bridge or some sort of system to get people across. But I think it was too big at that point. And the Lord told Joshua, put your foot in, which I think even that was kind of a scary moment. And when you put it in, the river's going to stop flowing. So he stopped the river. But the lesson here is that it didn't stop until they took the first step. And it's often that first step that's the hardest. Yeah.
I feel like I want to say stuff with that, but the reality is we know that. And I think that's one of the ones that it kind of speaks for itself, Yeah. I honestly don't even want to expand on it because of time.
I think so. I think that's good. Take the first step, and then the Lord will come through. Number 6, Joshua followed God's strange instructions for the battle of Jericho. Okay, yeah. So now they're past the Jordan. Now they're going city by city and conquering. So Joshua followed God's strange instructions for the battle of Jericho, and then for 6 days the army marched around the city. On the 7th day they marched 7 times and shouted, and the walls came crashing down. the Israelites swarmed in, killing every living thing except Rahab and her family. And I think that's just like, I love that God made him do this, just the strangest thing, because it was a test for Joshua and the Israelites. But I think it kept them in check for like, look, you are nothing without me. And so I'm going to make you do the most stupid thing, the most ridiculous thing, just to prove that I'm in control here. And I think the lesson here is that sometimes following God's lead isn't going to make sense, or it's not going to make sense when you're doing it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, that has me thinking of like little kids. Like, they want something, you ask them to do something, they say why, and often the response of parents is because I said so, or there's an expectation that they're supposed to follow even if they don't understand or it doesn't make sense. It also has me thinking of people I know that, at one point in their life, this is what God told them to do, and they're doing it, and then a few weeks later, it changed. And it has me thinking a lot of times, like, why, what changed? And I think reality is God isn't really changing, or maybe it's just uncertain, and so we as people, we make the change because we don't want to wait.
Yeah.
I think more times than not, God isn't making sense, or it's unclear.
Oh,
it kind of goes back to the last point of taking a first step, or we should say, keep taking that first step, or keep stepping. Two-step. After two-step. No. I don't know why I did that, but I won't say most times. I'd say more times than not. I feel like God isn't making sense with me, and we still have to keep moving.
Yeah, you have to. Okay. Lesson number 7. So now we're moving on to one of the other kind of really cool stories in Joshua and his whole kind of conquest for the promised land. But before battle, Joshua always consulted God. So before every city, before every battle, before every people that they're about to fight, Joshua remembered what God told him to study the law, and he would pray to God. He would ask God for guidance. He would ask him, basically, God, what's the game plan? But the one time that he didn't is when they were facing the people of Gibeon, and the people of Gibeon entered into a deceptive peace treaty with Israel, and God had basically forbidden Israel to make treaties with anyone in Canaan. And so Joshua, it was the one time that he slipped, and it was the one time that they really had to pay. So if Joshua had sought God's guidance first, then he wouldn't have made this mistake. And I think that's just so indicative of, like, consistency matters, and consistency pays off. But also, like, consult the Lord. Like, what are you missing out, or like what mistakes are you making because you're not consulting God?
It reminds me of Neil's message this weekend.
Yeah,
talking about open versus closed doors, and how do we approach that? And kind of what we're saying now is, no matter what it is, like, really consult God. And whether it looks great and it looks like a green light, everything looks perfect, like, still consult God, and still, and so what that looks like is, really, I would say, mentors and advice, and friends, and just kind of checks and balances, things in your life, the scriptures, to make sure that everything is in alignment. Because it's easy for us to get an idea, get excited. Right. Oh, this is God! It's an open door, and before you know it, we're not. So
yeah. What's so funny about this story particularly is that God had been leading the Israelites city by city, and they were just destroying. Like, it was it wasn't even a contest, basically. So the Gibeonites got word that basically, like, the cities are falling, and, like, we're in trouble. Like, they're going to get to us next. So instead of trying to fight, they very kind of keenly go to the Israelites, and they try to make a peace treaty. So to Joshua, he's like, oh, great, open door. Like, I don't have to fight these people. We can live peacefully. Wrong. It's not an open door. It's a trick door. Like you said, you have to consult God, because not all open doors are good doors, or they're doors that you're supposed to go through. Lesson number 8. Because Joshua was obedient, God performed another miracle at the Battle of Gibeon, and he made the sun stand still in the sky for an entire day so the Israelites could wipe out their enemies completely. So this is one of the stories, again, another miraculous kind of power that God showed in the story of Joshua. But they were fighting these people, and in order to wipe them all out and finish the battle, like, they were running out of daylight, and they would have to run away and go find them later. And so God made the sun stand still, and it was because Joshua obeyed God. It's because Joshua was listening to God. So I think, again, the lesson here is probably pretty straightforward, but obedience leads to miracles sometimes, and obedience leads to God's intervention.
Yeah. Also, this will lead into the next point, but I also would say obedience leads to fulfillment of God's promises, and kind of like our side of, if God says, do this, then, X happens. Well,
Yeah.
You do your end, and God fulfills his side.
Yeah, totally. Okay. Last lesson, number 9. Under Joshua's godly leadership, the Israelites conquered the land of Canaan. So this is the fulfillment of God's vision for Joshua and for Moses. But when they finally killed all the people, destroyed all the cities, conquered the entire land of Canaan, the promised land, finally, like it was done. And God fulfilled his promise to Joshua and to the Israelites after, it must have been at least 50, 60 years from the time that they were led out of Egypt. It was a completely new generation, but God does follow through. He does keep his promises.
Yeah, I want to do an episode about this. I think it's in our archive, but the thought of God's promises being conditional. I think a lot of us don't think about that. It's easy to think about God's love is unconditional, all that good stuff, which is great, but the reality is his promises are conditional. We do have a side we have to fulfill and do. And in this case, it was 60 years to see it come full circle. But that's the reality of how it works. So.
That is interesting. It was like the promise of this was, if you obey me and you follow my instructions to go take over the land of Canaan, the land is yours, and I will bless it.
So it's one of those things that we really don't think about a lot. I was in like a home group setting a couple of years ago, and I think I was given a message, or someone was given a message, but they were talking about God's promises. I think it was me. And at the end of it, one thing I said was that God's promises are conditional. And I remember it was David Matrenga, and at first he challenged it and said, I would, and he kind of said that that's incorrect. And we started openly talking about it as a group, and very quickly we were all actually no, that is right. God's promises are conditional.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that we don't really think about, but there's a lot of verses where it, like you just said, if then, and so that's kind of what got me thinking about this idea. But it's very true that they are conditional. And so, anyway, I'm sure we'll do an episode about that.
That'll be a good one. Okay. Well, there you go. 9 lessons from Joshua of the Bible. So we'll see you. We'll talk to you tomorrow in the next episode. Until then, go to cultivateandkeep.com/challenge, spread the word, and we'll be back with another episode tomorrow.
Bye.